The Bin Laden raid happened actually 4 months after another incident in which an undercover CIA contractor in Pakistan killed 2 Pakistanis and was in jail at the time, and then they had to pay blood money and all that. But 5 months later, a NATO airstrike inadvertently killed 24 Pakistani soldiers. So 3 major blows to the relationship, and we haven't recovered from that yet. And one of the main problems in Pakistan is that happens often in diplomacy, that the short-term US goals clash with the long-term US goals. Because short-term, what do we have? Drones, right? We have drone strikes almost every day. Because we want to kill terrorists that are along the border with Afghanistan. Why? Because there are American soldiers on the other side of the border. The long-term goals, of course, are stable Pakistan, stable Afghanistan, and even stable India. And to achieve that, you need to have a good relationship with the Pakistani government. Unfortunately, when you have these short-term goals in the drones, that doesn't help a good relationship with the Pakistani government. Before Pakistan, Cameron Manta was the ambassador to Serbia. And in Belgrade in 2008, his embassy was attacked. Because the United States had just recognized Kosovo as an independent state. Part of the embassy was actually set on fire. And a few days later, he got intel that the person who had approved that attack was none other than the Prime Minister of Serbia, Vojislav Koštunica. And so Manta decided, without consulting with Washington, that he would do everything he could to make sure that the Prime Minister lost the next election. He never told Condi Rice that he was going to do that. He didn't tell her after he did it. But he engineered this very sophisticated maneuver behind the scenes, which you can read about in the book. But he succeeded. But the Prime Minister was out of power, and he has not been back since. And you may think this is an interference in another country's domestic affairs. Fine. He thought that no leader of any country should be approving attacks on any embassy, and that kind of person has no business being in power in any country. So he did it. Before Serbia, he was the leader of what was called the Provincial Reconstruction Team in Iraq, PRT. This was up in the north of Iraq, in Mosul. And it was basically teaching the Iraqis in the province how to govern themselves. How to build infrastructure, how to set up a judicial system, how to build pave roads, build schools and hospitals. None of which this guy knew how to do. He didn't do that in diplomacy. He'd never done it before, so he had to quickly learn it for himself and then teach it to the Iraqis. The second of the 4 is Yuri Kim, which is,
Just wanted to ask you what his background was prior to becoming the ambassador to Pakistan.
Let me go on then. Let's do this in the Q&A. Because I don't want to go an hour and a half, and I may get off track here. But Yuri Kim is a Korean American who is currently the political counselor at the embassy in Ankara in Turkey. And you can imagine that she spent a lot of time in the last year working with the Turks to help the situation in Syria. Because thousands of Syrians have crossed over, thousands of refugees have crossed over to Serbia and live in tents and camps. At the time Cameron Manta was dealing with the embassy on fire in Belgrade, Yuri was in North Korea. And there are 275 American embassies and consulates around the world, but there isn't one in North Korea, because there are no diplomatic relations between the two countries. She was there to accompany the New York Philharmonic, which had a concert in Pyongyang in 2008. And she actually helped negotiate the visit, which was carrots, and we have carrots and sticks in diplomacy, right? And so the concept was a carrot for the North Koreans to do certain things in the nuclear negotiations that were going on at the same time. The third of the 4 is David Lindwall, who recently finished up a tour in Iraq at the embassy in Baghdad, where he was the political military counselor. And the job of any political military section in an embassy is selling American weapons to the host government. And he told me that the Iraqi government, since the fall of Saddam Hussein, has bought over $16 billion worth of American weapons. Before Baghdad, he was the deputy chief of mission in Haiti, where he managed the search for missing Americans after the 2010 earthquake. And his house collapsed from the earthquake, and he's alive today only because he wasn't home. Another embassy person actually died because she was home at the time. And before Haiti, he was deputy chief of mission in Guatemala, where one of the main things he and his team did was to reform the Guatemalan child adoption system. Did you know that American diplomats reform child adoption systems? Why? Why do they care? Is that part of diplomacy? Turns out that many Americans adopt children in Guatemala. In fact, Guatemala is number 3 on the list of foreign countries from which Americans adopt children, only behind Russia and China. And that system was apparently so corrupt that these American parents were spending, wasting thousands and thousands of dollars in bribes. And what does the average American do when they have frustrations with government? They call they call their congressman, and then Congress puts pressure on the Foreign Service, and the embassy in Guatemala goes and tries to do this. Which is not a massive an effort as was something else that the embassy in Chile did about the same time, which was to help reform the Chilean judicial system. Because until the 90s, the Chileans didn't have trials. One judge decided everything. They had trials on appeal, but not until then. And again, the US Embassy spends tons of money, a lot of human hours working on this thing, and the question is why? What's in it for us? Well, it turned out that many American companies in Chile were affected by that system because it was so unpredictable. The other reason was that in the 90s, things weren't going particularly well in Latin America. So the Clinton administration wanted one country to be the shining example of how everybody should be in the hemisphere. Democratically elected government and functional country. So they thought, why not Chile? Why not help Chile to do this and then tell everybody else, well, this is what you should be doing. The last of the 4 is Gavin Sundwall, who I met in 2003 in Beijing, where he was the head of the American Citizen Services. So someone said, helping American citizens, right? So the American Citizen Services, this embassy here has a section, ACS, American Citizen Services, and they can issue you a passport, as you know, they can register your newborn child, or register a death, or just help a tourist who's been marked. Gavin's first tour in the Foreign Service was in Panama, where one of the first things he did was he was sent to a Panamanian jail. And he tells a story in the book about how he was sitting across these 2 satanist killers, one with menacingly piercing blue eyes. And he was there because even though they were criminals, they were American citizens. So he had to make sure that the authorities were treating them as anybody should be treated in such circumstances. He also, there's this very touching story in the consular chapter, which is actually probably the most interesting chapter because it's about human lives. It's about heartbreak and child abductions and people who waited for hours to get a visa and then paid $130 and got rejected and never got their money back, which happens, of course, every day around the world. But it's still in Panama. He got a call one day that there was a dead American citizen, an elderly woman, and that nobody could go to identify her body in the morgue. So Gavin went. He didn't know who she was, but it was a formality. And then it turned out that nobody wanted to do a funeral for this woman. She had no relatives in Panama. The embassy called her relatives in the US, but they didn't want to come down. So Gavin said, if I didn't do a funeral, nobody would have done it. And he didn't have to, but he did it. He just came back from Afghanistan, where he was the press attaché. So putting out public relations fires is a big part of it, right? You may remember that a few months ago an American soldier went around and killed 16 Afghans, mostly women and children. Just before that, some American soldiers were burning the Quran and someone decided to videotape it, right, or photograph it. So this guy had, yes, enough on his plate, putting out these publicly. How do you explain either of these things to any public? And of course, being at the American Chamber of Commerce, I don't have to tell you that one of the things American embassies and consulates do every day is promote American business. If they don't, they should. But whether it's expanding markets, existing markets, or opening new markets, or lowering or eliminating tariffs, import duties, you know this better than me, that's one of the things, the main things that they do. How well is another story, but they do it. Okay, so here's a list of what I just said. The very short list of duties that these 4 people have done, and of course they've done much more, but I didn't want to speak for 3.5 hours. So look at this. Teaching effective governance, nuclear negotiations, cultural events, reforming child adoption and judicial systems, selling American weapons, recovering from natural disasters, promoting American business, issuing passports and visas, visiting prisoners in jail, fixing public relations problems. How can all this be part of the same profession? Do you know any other profession that has such a wide, diverse range of duties in it? This is not about having specialists who do each of these things. No, everybody in the Foreign Service is expected to do all of this. Because they never know when something might be needed, what certain skills or expertise may be needed and for how long. And I was trying to make sense of all this. And where does it fit? Because in my mind, anything you do in foreign policy has to fit into the big picture, right? Otherwise, why are you doing it? Because you're nice? Because there are people in the world who need your help? Well, yeah, there is more need than anyone can probably satisfy at any given time. But how does it make sense? So I went to this document, the National Security Strategy, which every president publishes, his own version. And here's what the current White House expects of the Foreign Service. To help prevent conflict, spur economic growth, strengthen weak and failing states, lift people out of poverty, combat climate change and epidemic disease, and strengthen institutions of democratic governance. Oh, really? I mean, how much money do you need to do this? Is this about changing the world? How many people do you need? How much time to achieve all this? And why? Again, my question through all this was why? Why are we doing all this? Why do we need to lift people out of poverty? Again, is it because we're nice? How do you give foreign aid because countries need it? This has to have, there must be a higher reason for this. And I wanted to know, and I'm not really surprised, but I wish more Americans ask these questions because that's their money being used, right? So, national interest. Again, in my mind, everything that's done should be in the name of national interest. But what is national interest? Well, this is the easy part, defining it. This wasn't the case before 9/11. In the 90s, Republicans and Democrats did not agree on what national interest was. Madeleine Albright in the book says, well, you can have humanitarian interests that rise to the level of the national interest. That's why we did Kosovo and Bosnia. But the Republicans said, no, that's nonsense. National interest is national interest. This humanitarian stuff, that's just nice to hear, but no, that's not national interest. Well, since 9/11, now they're saying, and you'll see the justification that both Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton give in the book about this, but the logic is now that for the US to be truly secure, the whole world has to be secure and stable. It doesn't matter, as Hillary Clinton says in the book, 9/11 proved conclusively that the 2 oceans on either side of the country don't defend us or protect us anymore. And an internal conflict in any country, and look at Syria, can spill over into the neighboring countries and affect the whole region and continent and ultimately affect US interests. whether they're security interests, political interests, or economic interests, right? This economy/business thing is a huge part of diplomacy. The same applies to prosperity. So, these are the three components of the national interest: security, prosperity, and the values of the country that the country stands for. And by the same logic, for the US to be truly prosperous, the argument is, obviously the world won't be prosperous in the next few thousand years, but the goal is to get as many countries as possible to have functioning economies and economic growth. And preaching this to other countries, as you can imagine, has not been easy in the last few years, because they say, well, if you know better, look at your own economy and your own employment rate, right? Well, they're still doing it, but it just makes it more difficult. So, how does this go back to that mission of the Foreign Service? So this world that is supposed to be secure and prosperous, so the US can be more secure and prosperous, that world doesn't exist yet, right? But that's the world we seek, the White House says. And it's the Foreign Service's mission, a part of the mission, to help bring it about. Condoleezza Rice used to call this transformational diplomacy. And some people thought, oh, that term is just too political because it implies we want to transform other countries in the US image. Other people said it's about imposing democracy. She says it wasn't about that. It was about good governance, and we'll see in a second what that means. But the world we seek doesn't exist. What exists is the world we have currently. So this is the world as it is. And this is in quotation marks, this comes from the National Security Strategy. So the world as it is, we have to deal with. And what is the tool we have to deal with that? It's diplomacy. And so that's traditional diplomacy. All these negotiations, maintaining relationships, all that is representing the US, that's all part of traditional diplomacy. And so that is the mission of the Foreign Service, to deal with the world as it is and to help to bring about a more secure and prosperous world so the US can be truly secure and prosperous. So that's, when I went and asked that question, what do we do, and I wasn't getting the answer I wanted, so that's what I came up with. Based on all these interviews and reading these documents and trying to make sense of it. I don't speak for the American government, I've never worked for them. I have no intention of joining the Foreign Service, I have no relatives who will. So I'm not endorsing anything or saying it's good or bad, I'm just trying to make sense of this and bring some transparency to what the United States is doing diplomatically around the world. Mentioned already, traditional diplomacy or classic diplomacy, in addition to managing foreign relations, this of course includes reporting, right? Have you read the WikiLeaks cables? All of them? All the 250,000 of them? So reporting, but also explaining US policies to the host government and explaining Singaporean policies to the US government. Representing the US, cocktail parties, right? That's how you represent the US. Assisting Americans, and of course the last, this is what we call multilateral diplomacy, which is typically managed by the UN, NATO, EU, ASEAN, APEC, all these international organizations. Transformational diplomacy. I still use this term because I think it correctly reflects what it means. Hillary Clinton hasn't used it. Because again, the politicizing, because every Secretary of State wants her own catchphrase, right? And this is about, as I said, this is about good governance. And what does that mean and why do we care about it? This is now the big thing in the Foreign Service. Good governance means having a responsible and accountable government that respects its people's rights, provides basic services like water and food and electricity, and also provides economic opportunity. So is this about imposing democracy? An accountable government basically means elected government. But Singapore is an interesting example because Some people would argue that there is no true democracy in Singapore, right? Yes, there are elections, but the same party has been in power since independence, since '63. At the same time, Singapore is given all the time as an example of good governance and effective governance. So maybe you don't need to have Western-style democracy, I don't know. But the reason that the US decided to care is that if you have a country like Somalia, for example, that was, and perhaps still is, a safe haven for terrorist groups, if you have a country that does not practice good governance, doesn't provide economic opportunity and jobs, look at what's happening in the Muslim world. Over half of the population there is under 40 years old. A big part of that is under 25. So if these people don't have jobs, they will have to turn to other means to feed their families. And that's how they might turn to crime, even terrorism. And that's when the US might be affected, because these people might join groups that can attack, as we saw 9/11. I have to say 9/11 2001 now, because we have 9/11 2012 when Libya, when the Benghazi consulate was attacked. But these groups can clearly attack the United States. So that's why we want to lift people out of poverty, not because we're nice, well, we are nice, but because the American government has decided that that directly affects the United States. So I asked at the beginning, what kind of money does one need to change the world and make it more secure and prosperous? Here's what we have. In 2011, the State Department and the budget for the State Department and all international programs, including foreign aid, was $53 billion. More than at any other time in history. Is this a lot? Well, actually, I shouldn't have shown you the number. I should have asked you first what you thought was spent on. But I already did. So, what do you think?
Does that include USA?
Yes.
How much would USA be?
35.
35 billion.
Yes.
This is annual.
Less than 1% of GDP, right? Less than 1% of GDP is foreign aid.
Include military aid?
No.
Cheap.
Well, according to the IMF, there are more than 100 countries in the world whose GDP is less than this. Human resources, we have 13,000 members of the Foreign Service, 8,000 diplomats or Foreign Service officers, and 5,000 Foreign Service specialists, who are the secretaries, the IT people, the doctors, and security people, accountants. Okay, so how does this compare to the military? What do you think the military budget is? How many times do you think it's, or percentage, how many times, how much bigger is it?
10 times.
No, more.